the book is not a roman a Clay. It's really not my personal story, although it's based in it's set in a world that I know better than almost anyone. And it is of course inspired by my experience as an editor in chief. Um, but was I really thinking about like, oh, I can't wait to write about this one day? That's going to be, the memoir I write down the road when all of my NDAs expire, but this book really is fiction. Although I did take a like maybe four like small incidences from things that happened to me in real life, and I appropriated them for the novel. But otherwise, it is pure fiction. I am so excited for everybody to meet Nikki Rose, my protagonist. The novel, If I Ruled the World, is set in New York City in the late 1990s, early 2000s, at the intersection of music and magazines and style. And it follows Nikki, who is a woman in her late 20s. She's messy, but she's magnetic. She's um, very smart, but she's making mistakes along the way as she goes toward her huge dream of becoming an editor in chief, right? And so we follow her along this journey as she, goes from working at a high-end fashion magazine to an urban women's music and lifestyle magazine, and what it feels like to be sort of displaced in both places. She is, feels like a token, at the fashion magazine where she works, but then when she gets to Sugar magazine, which is the urban women's magazine where she ultimately becomes the editor in chief, her authenticity is questioned, her credibility is questioned, right? So she's contending with feeling out of place in both spaces. And, we watch as she navigates these new worlds, as she really finds her voice. It's not a coming of age story because she's an adult, but it's coming of power story because she's coming into her own sense of self and she's finding out who she is in this world. And along the way, again, she's making mistakes, but, she is learning how to be an editor. She's learning, she's looking for true love. And so she's, looking to, sort of drop these relationships that she's in that I write about that are less healthy. And she, is trying to figure out how she can make, better, more stable decisions, relating to love. She wants to keep her long-time friendships, but she alienates her friends at one point and has an issue there. And it's only when she figures out how to feel empowered and when she finds her own voice that all of these sort of life goals come into place for her. So even though she makes mistakes, she's ultimately very inspiring because she kind of comes around into herself by the end. Yeah, well, when she gets to Sugar, she discovers that the parent company, New Voices, is in huge financial trouble, and her boss, who's a great character, her boss gives her 6 months essentially to turn Sugar around, right? And that's, an incredibly challenging thing to do for anybody, and certainly for a new editor-in-chief. So she is under a huge amount of pressure to do so and to figure out, what are going to be the things what that will make a difference, right? And so a lot of, her thinking is spent a lot of her thinking is around who's going to be on the cover of the magazine. We hear a lot about her cover choices and some of those are successful, some of those are mistakes, some of those are kind of questionable in terms of, her thinking around her decision making. And they're all fictionalized. So all of the main stars I'm talking about in the book are fictionalized. But when I write about the party scenes, or other kinds of, industry scenes, I do drop a bunch of names in. I have a bunch of people who are at these parties that I'm talking about. Like I talk about Jay-Z, I talk about Beyonce, I talk about, folks who are at these parties, Lil Kim. But in terms of them actually figuring into the story, all of those artists are fictional. I built the characters like you build a character. You figure out, what makes them special, what makes them unique, what do they look like, what do they sound like. I went a little bit into their background, but because they didn't figure too strongly into the core narrative, I didn't do a full character sketch. One of the main ones is Bobby Washington. She um, is like a neo soul artist, who's very inspirational. Slick Bishop, uh, Slick spelled with a Q. And by the way, you have no idea how hard it is to find a rapper's name that has not already been used. I must tell you, like that took me quite some time to find a cool rapper's name that wasn't already used. So we wouldn't run into legal problems because Slick Bishop is a, excuse me, notoriously misogynistic and murderous character. So we had to really be careful with that name. And then there's, of course, hold on one second. Excuse me. There's, of course, had the dueling rappers MC Red Hot and MC White Hot. MC Red Hot is giving you kind of puffy vibes. Malonzo is the primary antagonist. Um, and I've read the parts of the prologue online so I can tell everybody, that he is a deeply problematic character. He's actually the married former high school friend of my protagonist's mother. And he's also her first boss in the magazine world. And so my protagonist, Nikki, ends up having an affair with Alonzo that her parents find out about. And just as much drama ensues, and then Alonzo ends up blaming Nikki, for many things that are not actually her fault, but he ends up blaming her, and that creates a like a antagonism between them, and he becomes an incredibly powerful enemy for her to have. So that kind of follows her throughout the book. And then her boss Barbara is I love her. She's a tall black woman with a penchant for leather, so she's always in kind of matching leather ensembles, and she's a woman in a man's space, if you will, and she's just she's interesting, right? Because you on one hand, when you first meet her, you don't know if she's like a antagonist or if she's supporting Nikki, and by the end, it's still you're still a little on the fence, right? Because she's very hardcore. She's very much about her business. She needs Nikki to succeed. She's trying to give her the tools to succeed, but Nikki isn't listening to all of her advice, some of which is questionable. And so, this Barbara character is somebody who I think is very relatable, because it's not just, it's not clear what she absolutely wants. I mean, she's, you know, cares most about her business, but she's also, trying to um, make Nikki a successful editor in chief. You know what I mean? By hook or by crook. I love her group of friends so much. I wish I had a group of friends like this because they're just so cool. I mean, there's her best friend Teresa, who she's known since high school, who is a Afro Latina public defender, and they used to run track together, and Teresa's one of those like whip smart, kind of no bullshit people, who just really tell it like it is, and she supports Nikki, through thick or thin, but will also tell her when she thinks she's making a mistake, and then Nikki's got a friend who's by the name of Sophie, who is a Dutch woman who used to model in Europe and comes to the States and gets together with the rapper MC White Hot and opens up a hip hop R&B restaurant, sort of themed restaurant where the music industry hangs out, and she's like the only one out of this little crew who actually wears like baby fat and and you know what I mean. It's she's just but she's also like has a huge heart. Um, there's Kiara, who I also love, who Nikki meets when she goes into the urban world, and this is a woman who is just stunningly beautiful, runs a PR agency, and is married to a guy who's a very powerful real estate developer. Um, and she's helping Nikki navigate, as she kind of tries to figure out, how she's gonna, make her mark, as an editor in chief. And I thought she was a really kind of fascinating character too, and she ends up figuring pretty prominently in the book. That's one of the things I'm a little nervous about. Like when my book comes out, I don't want people. I mean, I'm nervous. People are going to pick it up and be like, "That doesn't sound authentic." Like, But I do have so much. I mean, so much lingo in my head, right? Like so much sort of era appropriate lingo, like so many different ways I've interacted with different people. And you're right, like a rapper from Atlanta talks very different than a rapper from St. Louis, who talks very different than a rapper from, Los Angeles. You know what I mean? So it is different, and it's important to get those nuances. And so I was really trying to make sure that all the texture of the book was authentic, to the actual people and to the time. And and I hope that it is.